This is Press Play on KCRW. I'm Madeline Brand. In the city of Tripoli, along Libya's coast, there are several warehouses ringed with barbed wire and guarded by men with guns. These warehouses are not storing goods or equipment or materials. They've been turned into secret prisons to hold thousands of migrants, sometimes indefinitely and under the most inhumane conditions. Most of the migrants in these prisons are from sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, and they were caught trying to cross the Mediterranean to try to start a new life in Europe. But Europe is ambivalent at best about these migrants, welcoming many in the past, but now, according to my next guest, helping fund the Libyan Coast Guard, which captures and imprisons the migrants to keep them out of Europe. Investigative reporter Ian Urbina wrote about Libya's migrant detention camps for the latest issue of The New Yorker. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you begin your story with a man named Aliyu Khande, and he was in one of these prisons. Tell us about him, where he was from, and how he ended up in one of these places.
Aliyu was in many ways a quintessential climate migrant. He's a 28-year-old guy from a country called Guinea-Bissau, which is among the poorest countries in the world, and it's in West Africa. Aliyu was a farmer and a father and a husband. He had 2 kids when he left, and he left because his farm was, falling apart. He couldn't grow anything. He couldn't feed his family. And 2 of his brothers had made their way previously to Europe and were doing okay. And he thought this was his only option. So he began a kind of standard journey through the Saharan desert, ultimately into Libya, where he bought his way onto a migrant raft that was aimed at crossing the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, he was captured halfway there.
Captured by the Libyan Coast Guard?
That's right. He was captured by the Libyan Coast Guard and brought back to shore, where he was put in, one of the most notorious detention centers, Al-Mabani.
Describe what it's like inside that place.
So Al-Mabani is one of maybe 12 or 15 official detention centers. It opened quite recently in January of 2021. On typical days, it would have maybe 1,000, 2,000 migrants in it. More recently, its numbers have skyrocketed, 6,000. The conditions in all the facilities, in Mabani in particular, it's so bad that the UN described what's going on in there as crimes against humanity. Extortion, rape, torture, murder, malnutrition, spread of disease from overcrowding, kind of routine violence, forced labor. All of these things have been very well documented in these facilities and Al-Mabani in particular.
So when Aliyu is captured and gets into one of these places, this is earlier this year, what does he think? And does he think he'll be let out fairly quickly, or does he think this is the end of the line for him?
My sense in, interviewing migrants is that the kind of worst, in some ways, worst violence that is experienced is the sense of being disappeared, and the sort of sense that you have no knowledge of how long you'll be held there, what will happen to you, will anyone be informed you're there, does anyone know you're even alive? So I think, in talking with his, other cellmates, he was like all other migrants, completely uncertain about his fate and in a sort of slow motion panic.
What does it take to get out?
Typically, migrants get out a couple ways. One, they are extorted and they pay up. So guards walk around with a cell phone and daily, weekly offer the migrants the opportunity, if you will, to call a loved one, a friend, someone who's willing to put up the fee or ransom. It's typically about $500 US, the equivalent. If you are so poor that you don't have anyone to help you in that way, or you don't know phone numbers or whatever, then you're stuck there. Or you get eventually squeezed long enough and the guards realize, the militia that runs it realizes they're probably not going to get anything out of you. And so they can sell you to another militia, another detention center that might think that they can somehow squeeze you the right way to get some funding out of you. Or they might use you for forced labor. Many of these migrants are used in agriculture and construction, the women often in sex work. So these are the various ways you might get handed out of the facility.
So sold into slavery is what you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, in 2017, CNN actually had footage of a slave market, that they had someone film where migrants were being literally auctioned on the block for fees for those that wanted to buy them for the sake of using them in labor. And the forced labor is well documented by the UN and others as a routine occurrence. It's also not illegal in Libya to use migrants in this way.
Where does the European Union come into this in terms of tacitly or not so tacitly supporting this?
And I think of this metaphorically and on a meta level. The EU writ large and Italy quite leading the effort have kind of decided that they really need to stem the flow of desperate people arriving on their shores. And so there's a sort of war on migration that is a EU-funded war, and its goal it's not a war on migrants, but it is a war on migration. Its goal is to stop the flow of these people further upstream. And so sort of Europe is southernizing its border by pushing its policies into Libya, into Niger. In that war, you have an air force, a navy, and an army. The air force is Frontex, that's the EU border agency, and they put drones and airplanes over the Mediterranean, and they search for the migrant boats and call them in, and that information gets handed off to the Libyan Coast Guard. That's the Navy. Libyan Coast Guard goes out. It's EU funded, entirely trained. All the boats were bought by the EU. The Libyan Coast Guard goes out, catches the migrants, arrests them, brings them back to shore, and that's where you encounter the army, metaphorically, and that's the on-land force, and that's the sort of gulag that exists on land where all these migrants are kept and sold in one way or another.
So what changed? Because Italy and Germany several years ago were pretty permissive when it came to welcoming migrants.
What drove the change, I think, was multiple factors. One was economics. Italy was on the cusp of a third recession, and the cost of dealing with these extra people coming in was not small. I think politics, the xenophobia, the fear-mongering, and the legitimate concerns that might exist around managing the flow of people into your country, you sort of crescendoed in the hands of the political right in Italy, and it paid dividends for them politically as they seized on a general frustration and fear about all these folks, which only got worse with COVID. So the Italian Navy is not engaged in rescue work because now that's the Libyan Coast Guard aimed at pushing them back to Libya. The general opinion towards those who do make it to Italian shores has shifted publicly. And when the migrants arrive, they're generally put on other boats, quarantine boats, and brought back out to sea so that they're kept off land and away from the population.
And do they know? They must know what's going on inside these prisons, right? European officials?
Yeah, no, it's an entirely open secret, and because report after report has come out about the brutality, and the EU and EU parliamentarians, even those who quite support the migration policy of pushing them back, essentially say, look, that's the Libyan government's fault, and any complaints or criticisms you have of how these people are being treated in the facilities, take it up with the Libyan government. That's a little bit dishonest and disingenuous because, there would be none of these detention facilities if the EU wasn't funding the incredibly effective apparatus at, turning the people back. So that's point one. And point two, the EU is also, preventing humanitarian groups that are actually trying to truly rescue the migrants and instead backing the Libyan Coast Guard, which is not rescuing them, it's arresting them and returning them to some of the worst prisons on land.
How many of these migrants who are apprehended, how many of them successfully reach European shores after they manage to get out?
So don't hold me to this exact number, but I think the last numbers I saw for this calendar year were around 20K for Italy. And that's quite a drop off. If you think about in 2015, there was 500,000 that arrived.
So what happened to Aliyu?
So Aliyu was captured, brought back to shore, and put in Al-Mabani. He was there for roughly 2 months. One night, a bunch of Sudanese detainees decided they were going to make a go at escaping and began chiseling away at the bars to try to see if they could get out. Migrants said it's a terrible idea. Don't do it. Whenever that happens, even if you get out, we're all going to take a beating. Some will get taken to this torture cell, which is true. A fight broke out. Melee emerges. 3 hours of brutal fighting between the migrants. The guards look on, cheer, film with their cell phones, and ultimately get sick of it and open fire. And the guards open fire on the migrants through a window. Aliyu gets hit in the neck, and he bleeds out and dies.
Mm. Wow. Leaving behind 2 kids, as you mentioned, and his whole family.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, his family was ruined, the main breadwinner for 3 kids because he had two already and one was born after he left. So now 3 kids, and a wife with no breadwinner and land that doesn't produce.
And so while you were reporting this story, you experienced kind of a very small version of this. Minor, it wasn't minor, but it wasn't to the level of what the migrants experience. You were arrested yourself and kidnapped and tortured. What happened?
So I had taken a team to Libya. So it was me and 3 others. There was a Dutch documentary filmmaker, a photographer, videographer, and an editor. So 3 people besides me. It was a Sunday night, around 8 o'clock. We'd been reporting all day, had been really having a lot of success piecing together Aliyu's story. The 3 others wanted to go out to get out of the hotel and go to dinner. You can't travel around without armed security, so they were in an armed security convoy, heading to dinner. I stayed in the hotel room because I had work to do. I was on the phone with my wife. Knock on the door. I go thinking it's one of them who turned back, one of my teammates. In barge about 12 men, gun to head, put me on the floor, hood me, beat me pretty severely, break a couple of ribs and do kidney damage and really go at it. And ultimately, after they were done with that, dragged me out, still hooded, barefoot, through the lobby, put me in a car, taking me to a secret prison. The other 3 were, like I say, on their way to dinner. They get hit in the middle of an intersection by the same militia. They get taken to the same prison and were kept there. Put in isolation cells, told that we're CIA spies and we're there to embarrass Libya and we're going to pay the consequence of being spies. Me in particular, I was sort of the overlord of the spying team, according to these folks. And luckily, I had been on the phone with my wife, so she heard the initial capture, and she had alerted the U.S. State Department, and that began a whole process of applying pressure on the Libyan government, which ultimately succeeded, and we were evacuated from the country after 6 days in captivity.
Wow. So I'm wondering if your experience affected the way that you saw the story in any way.
I mean, I think you captured it perfectly in your earlier question, in that my experience offered a distinct firsthand but small window into the sort of unaccountable, unpredictable, violent way that people can be disappeared in Libya. And that's exactly, in some ways, on point to what we were investigating, which was part of this detention, part of this whole migration system and detention and sort of militia control of them. So it was relevant, just what it feels like in a small way to go through that sort of capture.
So I'm wondering if news has gotten out in the rest of Africa and the Middle East about this detention system, and people aren't even bothering to try. I mean, you said that they're being rounded up very efficiently, but is it preventing them from leaving their homes in the first place?
No. I mean, look, I think that if you're a small rural farmer in Guinea-Bissau who maybe speaks Portuguese and Fulani, you don't read, there's no cell service, no internet, and where you live, you're not a big consumer of the New Yorker or the web, or, so you're not getting even much news even by word of mouth. Now, Aliyu's two brothers had made it to Europe. And so it was no surprise to Aliyu and that this was an incredibly dangerous route. And so migrants are aware of it, how dangerous it is, but their desperation is so intense that this is sort of a gamble that makes a lot of sense, as scary as it is.
Ian Urbina is an investigative reporter, and you can read his big story on the secret migrant detention camps in Libya in this week's issue of The New Yorker. Ian, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, we will have movie reviews.
I also thought they were in some sort of competition to see, like, how many high-powered stars can you get in one film and completely waste all of their talent.
Don't Look Up, as well as, of course, West Side Story and a couple more. That's next on Press Play.